Welcome back everyone to another Tony Stewart Sprint Car Racing setup. In today's video, we'll focus on the 410s at Grant Park. And I love tracks like Grant Park in this game because it really exposes any deficiencies you have in your driving style. Any weaknesses you have in your approach to driving will be put on full display at a track like this. It's a 3/8 mile track with very little banking. In fact, when you're out there driving it feels like no banking at all in the corners. So if you try to go into the corners too hard, you overcook the entry and find yourself sliding up the track, you are going to waste multiple tenths. In fact, I tried multiple setups at this track and ran basically the same speed with all of them. They all felt a little bit different, but I ran the same speed with them because I was driving the car the same way. The way I ultimately found speed at this place was to really analyze how I was driving the car and try to correct errors that I was making. Now for me, the biggest error I usually make is charging the corners too hard. And what that ultimately means for me is that I drift up on the center of the corner, miss my apex, and that costs me speed all the way on the exit and down the next straightaway. So as I was analyzing things like that, I ultimately gained speed simply through changing the way I was driving the car. I can tell you that my lap times would vary 3 to 5 tenths easy on a lap by lap basis just based on mistakes I was making driving the car. So my best advice to you at a track like this, and really at all of the tracks, but in particular a track like this where you don't have a lot of banking to lean on, is that whenever you find yourself lacking speed and you're not going as fast as you would like, or maybe as fast as some of your friends are going, then the first thing I would look at is how you're driving the car rather than the setup. As I mentioned earlier in the video, I tried multiple different types of setups and they all worked very well and gave me similar speed out of the car. So as we move through the different parts of the setup, I will point out some of the changes that I made, some of the differences in the setups and how they affected the car. So hopefully that will give you some ideas on how to dial the car in to give you the feel you're looking for. We'll begin the setup discussion with the shock values. And here you see a lot of 4s and 5s, primarily 5s, with a couple of differences. First is the left front bump value, which I use as a very minor adjustment to the corner exit. So if I want the car to be a little looser on corner exit, then I drop this number a little bit. If I want the car to be a little tighter on corner exit, then I increase this number a little bit. So you can see, but again, it's a very minor adjustment when compared to some of the other changes you can make to the car. But it is something that I do from time to time just to get a little bit different feel and try to optimize the setup as best I can. The other difference you'll notice is something I've pointed out regularly in these setup videos, and that is I like to use the right rear bump at the minimum of 3.0. That is because I want maximum grip on corner exit out of this corner of the car. We're already using the right rear in such a heavy way and relying on it quite a bit in driving the car. So I like to give it as best feel as I can, and that for me comes from using this minimum value. If you want the car to be looser, if you want to rely even more on the right rear tire, then by all means increase this number to 4, 5, 6, or even higher, and that will certainly loosen up the car. Moving on to the weight settings, maximum left side weight, minimum front weight, although there's really no reason to decrease the amount of left side weight, because the more left side weight on an oval, then that simply means that the car is going to turn better. But the front weight is a little different. While I'm using the minimum, if you find that the car is just too loose overall, or maybe even a bit unstable for you, then try increasing this number to around 39.0 or maybe even higher, and that will certainly tighten up the car and reduce the amount of rotation you get from the car. Moving on to the cross weight, another setting that has become a favorite of mine is to use maximum cross weight. And I do this because the car turns so well on its own that I need to control that rotation, and I find that the cross weight is a very good way for me to do that. And that really comes into play in particular on the corner entry, where I need the car to rotate, but I don't want it to over-rotate where we start scrubbing off a lot of speed. So a higher cross weight number helps to slow down that rotation. It really helps to give me better control. However, if you find that the car is just too tight for you, particularly on corner entry, and you need the car to rotate more, then drop this number to something around 53 or even lower, and that will certainly do that. And this is one of those differences in the setups that I tested for this track. I tested down to about 52, maybe even a little bit lower than that, and it worked just fine. The car simply rotated a little bit quicker on corner entry and allowed me to get back to the throttle a little quicker. Now, it introduced some other issues, such as over-rotation a lot of times based on my driving style, but 52, 53% certainly would work just fine given the other values that we have in the setup. Front and rear heights, really not a lot to be concerned here. I like to run the front just a little bit higher, but basically what you're looking for here is you want to keep the car from bottoming out. As long as you're not bottoming out, there's not a whole lot to worry with on the heights. Now that's would not be the case in real life, but for the game purposes, it really doesn't seem to make much of any difference other than the fact that you want to keep the car from bottoming out. Moving on now to the torsion bar diameters, and this is an area where I really worked a lot on this track and something we're going to talk about at length. So for the left front, you notice that we're using the minimum, which is my preference, because I like to use all in all, the smallest bar diameter that I can get by with. That's the feel I prefer out of the car. Some people will prefer a much stiffer feel in using higher numbers here, but for me, the minimum is where I start. So in this case, I am only using 1 tick of difference between the left front and the right front. The reason for that is the lower number you use on the right front, the more that's going to help the car rotate on corner entry. So this gives you another alternative to help the car to rotate. We've already talked about how the cross weight can help you with that. Well, this is just another way of accomplishing that goal. So normally I would prefer to run like 1.0 right in this location, but here I dropped it down one more just to allow the car to rotate a little bit more on entry. Also, you notice that I'm not running any preload on any corner of the car. I certainly tested that up as high as about 2.0 or maybe even 2.5 here. That will tighten up the entry. Any preload you add to the right front will tighten up the car overall, and in particular, I use it to tighten up the entry. But here, based on some of the other parts of the setup, I really didn't need that. So no preload on this particular setup. Moving to the rear of the car, normally the left rear would match the left front, which would be at the minimum of 0.95 here. It is 1 tick higher than that. And then the right rear is 1 tick higher than that. So you notice that overall, the rear of the car is slightly stiffer than the front of the car. I did that because I wanted the rear of the car to be a little bit more active. I wanted the car to rotate a little bit more, and one of the ways you can do that is to make the rear of the car a little bit stiffer than the front of the car. So if you find that the car is too loose, one of your options to tighten it up a little bit is drop both the left rear and right rear numbers by 1 click, get them down to be even with the front, and that will tighten up the car, slow down the rotation overall. Now, the tire pressures is another area I tested out some things, really didn't see a huge difference. So whenever I don't see a huge difference, I prefer to leave things pretty much as they are and let you guys play around with them a little bit more. The one area I played around with most would be the right rear and the difference in PSI from the left rear to the right rear, because this is primarily where I wanted to work on gaining speed, was from the center of the corner to the exit. The bigger the difference you have in air pressure between the right rear and the left rear, here we see 5 PSI difference. The higher that number is, the looser the car will generally be from the center of the corner off on exit. The less difference you have in these numbers, the tighter the car will generally be. So that gives you something else that you can play around with. On the front of the car, primarily I would be interested in the right front. The lower you make the right front, the more the car will want to rotate. Similar to what we talked about with the torsion bar diameters. And then the higher the number you put in the right front pressure, the tighter the car will want to be. So the lower the number on the right front, the looser the car will want to be. And then the higher number, the tighter the car will want to be. Moving on to the spacing, you notice that the right rear spacing is maxed out, but the left rear is actually at the minimum. Normally, I've been using the maximum of 14.5, and This is an area that I tested quite a bit with, and 14.5 worked just fine. Again, I was getting very similar lap times here, but ultimately the way I felt like I needed to drive the car, the 13.5 ended up working a little better for me because it allowed me to be a little bit more consistent in running faster times as opposed to maybe necessarily a faster overall time for a single lap. So 13.5 worked great, all the way up to 14.5 worked great. What you're looking for here is the lower the number you use on the left rear spacing, the looser the car will be. The higher the number you use, up closer to that 14.5 max value, the tighter the car will want to be. So again, keep that in mind. With the right rear, the higher the number, the looser the car. The lower the number, the tighter the car. Brake bias, this is something I do use at this track. I like to use the brake a little bit on corner entry just to sort of get the car pointed in the direction I want. So for me, it's very important to get this number dialed in so that I don't have the car too loose or too tight as I'm applying the brakes on corner entry. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not using a lot of brake. It's just a smooth application of the brake on corner entry, maybe 10 to 15% brake, so very little, but it certainly helps to smooth out the entry and get the car pointed in the direction. So the lower number you use on the brake bias, the looser the car will be under braking, and the more the car will want to rotate. The higher the number you use on the brake bias, the tighter the car will be. So if you're finding that you're too loose on corner entry, then raise this number some to around 50, maybe even 55 or higher, and that will certainly tighten the car up whenever you apply the brakes on corner entry. Then moving on to the wings, you can see maximum 30 and 30 on front and rear, and no adjustment to the rear wing position. If you wanted to, say, tighten up the car, then you could lower this front wing number. That would take away a little bit of front downforce and tighten up the car. Or you could leave the front and rear wing values the same and come in and make an adjustment to the rear wing position. The more you adjust this, the more to the rear wing will go, and that will tighten up the car. But as it was, the car was just fine the way it was, but this is certainly something you can use to help tighten the car. Wheel lock is at my standard 10 degrees. If you prefer something like the default, which is like 17 or 18 usually, that will give you a much quicker steering response out of the car. I prefer a little slower steering response simply because that's a preference based on my driving style. I prefer to tug on the wheel a little bit more as opposed to having ultra quick response. So if you want quicker response out of the wheel, then use higher numbers here, 12, 14, up to around the default of 17 or 18. If you need even slower response out of the wheel, then you'll want to drop this number to 8, 7, or whatever. So that'll give you some idea there. Steering offset for me is very much tied to the Stagger, and since I'm using the maximum of 20 inch of Stagger, then I want to use a little bit higher value for the steering offset. The steering offset is used to offset the amount that you're going to have to turn to the right based on the amount of Stagger that you're putting in. The more Stagger you put in it, the looser the car will be, and the harder it will want to pull to the left all on its own. So the steering offset can be used to offset that pull to the left. And so 1.75 is about the highest number I feel comfortable using. I tested up around 2.0, maybe even a little bit higher, but it's just not the feel I'm looking for. I don't mind turning to the right some, and I find that if I get up around 2.0 while using this maximum Stagger, that the steering wheel feels a little bit clunky to me around the center line. So 1.75 down to around 1.5 is more of a personal preference for me. So moving on to the Stagger, again, as I mentioned, this is maximum of 20.0 on the Stagger, which means that the car is going to want to turn all by itself without you having to do anything. That allows us to get through the corner with maximum speed. However, if you find that the car is simply too loose or unstable, it's pulling so hard to the left, then try dropping this down to around 17 or 18 and then running some more laps, and that should tighten the car up quite a bit. Moving on finally to the rear end ratio. 5.7 is about the most RPM I could run out of this. I also tested down to around 5.5, 5.4, and again, it all ran perfectly fine. It all just depends on how you use the throttle, how much you're on the throttle. This is a track where you could run it wide open if you wanted to, and simply use a combination of the steering and the brakes to get the car pointed in the right direction and get you through the corner. However, that's not the way I prefer to use the throttle. I have found that being less aggressive on the throttle and being more patient with it actually ended up with me running better lap time. So patience overall is really a key and something you should strive for at this track, because as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this track and this type of track where you have those long flat corners will really expose any issues you have and any faults you have in your driving style. The good news though is that exposing those faults can lead to some breakthroughs and improve your own driving style if you put the work in. So that's going to do it for today. Thank you very much for joining me, and stay tuned for more Tony Stewart Sprint Car Racing.